It's been a große Freude. It's a great pleasure to me to introduce you to you as the speaker of tonight, of our Verfassungsblog lecture, and the keynote speaker of our conference on choice architecture and democracies, Sunstein. Now, as we read, Sunstein is the Robert Wormsley University professor at Harvard University and the former administrator of the White House Office of Regulatory Affairs and Information. But this is just a title, and I think instead of reading lists of titles, degrees, honors, and functions, and there are very many of them, it may be more interesting for you and more appropriate to share some short thoughts designed more for a general audience on the way and style of his thinking. Since the 1990s, Sunstein has published an astonishing amount of widely quoted books and papers about an amazing range of topics, among others on a constitutionalist perspective on the debate between liberals and Republicans, on the functions of rights in the regulatory state, on legal methodology, especially on the place of analogical thinking in judicial arguments, on the institutional limits of judicial review, on the function of free speech, on limits of legislative delegation, on democratic deliberation in general, and in particular on the internet, on the regulation of preferences in specific regulatory regimes, and more generally as part of a research agenda which we now call behavioral law and economics, and so on and so forth. Remains the question, what holds all these topics together? Is there something like a common theme or red thread in Sunstein thinking? And perhaps we might find something. Firstly, Sunstein is a public lawyer. In the tradition of American legal realism, it seems to me, all his texts are driven by a vivid interest in the normative and factual contexts of American constitutional and administrative law. And to be sure, this is a much weaker disciplinary identity than, let us say, to say someone is a continental European public lawyer. Academic legal research in the United States is often a more interdisciplinary project than in Germany. And the law school, and especially I think the law school of the University of Chicago, which was quite formative for Sunstein's thinking, it seems to me, is a place that is shaped, not only visited, but truly shaped by economists, by historians, by sociologists, and by philosophers. Secondly, Sunstein's intellectual path led him from more normative background concepts in political theory and legal methodology to more empirical ones like those from economic theory. Maybe it will lead him back today when he talks about the ethics of choice architecture, maybe not. Thirdly, there may be some more substantive core elements of his thinking in all of his work, and I will just try to name a few of them. Sunstein is a reformist. His topic is the path to institutional reform, founded in the belief in the abilities of public action that is somehow situated beyond the old debate between big and small government. Sunstein develops general arguments for small-scale solutions. From his vindication of analogy in legal reasoning to today's topic of nudging, there's a pertinent Sunsteinian idea of a highly contextualized rationality for little problems that can then make a difference for the whole. As a reformist, Sunstein is a critic of the status quo. Sunstein's thinking does not accept the status quo as justified as such. Again, from his critique of the ideal of constitutional neutrality in his 1990s book, The Partial Constitution, to his justification of nudging today, there's a common argument. Non-intervention is a form of intervention. Therefore, we have to make intervention explicit. Connected with this is finally a very pragmatist and a very American belief in the malleability, the plasticity of the world. A decisive move in Sunstein's dialogue with the economists is the conviction that preferences can change and can be changed. And the decisive move in his dialogue with academic lawyers and regulators is that sometimes we have to change the world to change the rules. Last but not least, and I may speak from experience in this case, Sunstein is a wonderful teacher. And therefore, we are very happy to have you here and to learn something from you tonight. Welcome.
Look at all the people. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for that very kind introduction. It's a tremendous honor to be here, really. It's very moving for me to be here. I was given a tour of Berlin this afternoon, and there are a lot of cities in the world that have over the past decades experienced change. But the extraordinary path in Berlin, I can't quite say the words that Kennedy said, though I believe them in my heart because my pronunciation is so terrible, but I feel like I think everyone on the planet in some deep sense, I am a Berliner. Okay, this is going to be about ethics, and the motivation for these remarks is first practically this conference, which is about the ethics of choice architecture and nudging. But second, there hasn't been, I think, sufficient thought about the relationship between behaviorally informed approaches to politics and life and to the ethical restrictions on what governments can do to individuals or on what individuals can do to one another. So this is an effort to engage in a preliminary way on the ethical questions. And I'll say two things by way of general orientation. First is, there is a risk, I think, that abstractions with respect to choice architecture and nudging can produce trouble. There's a great Berliner, one of my heroes, Albert Hirschman, the great social theorist, who, if you look at Hirschman's own work, it was often focused on a detailed particular and drawing something out of a detailed particular. His eyes were extremely acute, and he never got lost in abstractions. And I want to make a plea of bringing our ethical concerns in direct contact with concrete practices as a path forward and a way of not getting distracted. The second general orientation point I want to raise has to do with the concept of manipulation. This seems to me a very important and underanalyzed concept, and it's in a way the soft spot of these remarks. That is, the manipulation idea is the one where I myself feel there's most to learn and to keep thinking about. No one likes to be manipulated, and no one is proud of being a manipulator, though in the private sector and in some governments, manipulation does happen. It's very important, I think, to get very concrete about what is wrong with manipulation as a way of treating people, and how does that bear on the practices of government. And if you're thinking about Kant, Immanuel Kant right now, good, because Kant is in a way the shadow and also in some respects the hero of these remarks. Okay, I have a story for you, not from Kant. I don't think Kant would have enjoyed this story very much. It's from a novelist named David Foster Wallace. There are two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" The two young fish swim for a moment, and then eventually one of them looks over to the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" I think this is an illuminating story because it suggests that there is background activity, architecture, if you like, by which all human beings are affected, and we often don't identify it as such. We don't even ask the question, what the hell is water or the equivalent, until someone says, how is it? This is a suggestion that if you are a consumer, a user of automobiles, an investor, a visitor to websites, a user, of course, of the internet, a visitor to grocery stores, someone who engages with the law of contract or property or human rights, there is the equivalent of water often in the background, not in the foreground, and it is affecting choices. So what I'm trying to draw from this story by a novelist, not a legal theorist, is that some kind of architecture is in place whether or not we see it, and that suggests it's going to be unhelpful to deplore or to challenge an architecture as such. Just as fish are swimming in water whether they recognize it, so too human beings have a background architecture which is often not readily visible to them. Okay, but, and I mean this lengthy quotation to be in some tension with the water passage. This is from Aldous Huxley's novel Brave New World. You know the novel Brave New World? This is the novel. But I don't want comfort. I want God. I want poetry. I want real danger. I want freedom. I want goodness. I want sin. That's being said by the savage, who is the hero of Huxley's novel, someone who is deploring a world of very comfortable choice architecture. Mustafa Mond, who is his interlocutor, says, "In fact, you're claiming the right to be unhappy." "All right then," said the savage defiantly, "I'm claiming the right to be unhappy." Not to mention the right to grow old and ugly and impotent, the right to have syphilis and cancer, the right to have too little to eat, the right to be lousy, the right to live in constant apprehension of what may happen tomorrow, the right to catch typhoid, the right to be tortured by unspeakable pains of every kind. There was a long silence. "I claim them all," said the savage at last. Now, if that's a moving passage, and I think it is, it's a moving passage about the humanity of discomfort and struggle and pain and suffering. We might think that those who would claim the right to catch typhoid and to be tortured by unspeakable pains of every kind, to have syphilis and cancer, maybe have not had the lived experience of those things. Nonetheless, there's something deeply human in the passage, and I hope you'll keep that in mind as an objection to comfortable choice architecture, as a background concern in these remarks. Okay, here's a preface and some reminders. There are just two ideas. One is libertarian paternalism. That's not a lovely term. If a book were called Libertarian Paternalism, very few people would buy it. But the basic idea is that it's possible, isn't it, sometimes to preserve freedom of choice while also being paternalistic in the sense of steering people in a direction that someone thinks is a good idea. So if when you buy a refrigerator, I'm not sure if it's true here, but if when you buy a refrigerator here, you can see the energy efficiency of the refrigerator, you got a label? That's libertarian paternalism. It preserves freedom of choice, but it's paternalistic in the sense that it's steering people. There isn't a label that talks about power of the refrigerator or coldness of the refrigerator. There's a label that talks about the energy efficiency of the refrigerator. Okay, the only other concept is choice architecture, and here the basic idea is that all of our choices have an architecture behind it. That is an inevitable fact of human nature, and choice architecture often materially affects our decisions, whether or not we're alert to the effects. If we care about libertarian paternalism, we are going to favor freedom-preserving, low-cost tools, and I'm going to suggest that there's a strong ethical argument for using those tools. You may have noticed there's some choice architecture in the slide. The word ethical and for are both in bolds. That's a nudge. That's why they're in bold. If we care about welfare, as we should, if Jeremy Bentham is one of our heroes, then we will want freedom-preserving, low-cost tools. If we care about autonomy, a la Kant, or self-government, a la Habermas, then we will often be positively inclined to nudges. Often there is little expense for the private or public sector, so it's good for democratic self-government and economic growth, hence the growing worldwide interest in tools of this kind. Those are meant as reminders. If any of that is new to anyone in the room, please raise your hand and blush a little bit. Okay, I'm hoping that's familiar territory. Okay, this is from a recent regulation by the United States government, which is designed to have calorie labels on menus. So when you buy chocolate cake or chicken, you can see how many calories they have. This is a quotation. "The final rule may assist consumers by making the long-term health consequences more salient and providing contextual cues of food consumption. The behavioral economics literature suggests that distortions internal to consumers due to time-inconsistent preferences, myopia or present bias preferences, visceral factors such as hunger, or lack of self-control can also create the potential for policy intervention to improve consumer welfare." Might you agree that isn't, in terms of language, a poetic passage? Nonetheless, it's making a point about the potential uses of choice architecture and nudges to help consumers. This is from the president of the World Bank, Jim Yong Kim, from the very recent 2015 World Development Report. It's just out for a few weeks. Insights into how people make decisions can lead to new interventions that help households to save more, firms to increase productivity, communities to reduce diseases, and consumers to save energy. Research shows that small differences in context, convenience, and salience can have large effects on crucial choices, such as whether to send a child to school, prevent illness, or save to start a business. Of course, some nations in the world are suffering terribly from Ebola. Some nations have successfully avoided risks to themselves, and some of the steps that have been taken that are helping with respect to Ebola are in the nature of what's being discussed here. Nudges, uses of choice architecture. Okay, so we're going to focus on the ethical questions and just have four foundations. The first is welfare, where Friedrich Hayek and John Stuart Mill are heroic figures. The second is autonomy. The third, also associated with Kant, is dignity. And the fourth, with Habermas, is democratic self-government. I think I want to suggest that for Kant, it's especially important to isolate the difference between autonomy and dignity, where autonomy has as its opposite coercion, and dignity has as its opposite humiliation. And these are two very different concerns. We can have cases where autonomy is preserved, but dignity is not, and we can have cases where dignity is endangered less than autonomy. And of course, under the German constitutional system, dignity is a very central value. Okay, here are my four conclusions. So I'm giving away the argument right now. You can stop listening after this slide if you like. The four conclusions are: first, it's pointless to object to choice architecture and nudging as such. The private sector nudges, as does the government, and to object to those two enterprises is like objecting to water if you are a fish. If there are companies that are selling automobiles and refrigerators and clothes washers, they are going to be nudging. If there is a government that runs programs, Social Security programs, labor programs, even if it's a very small government, it will be nudging. If it has a website, it's going to be nudging. If a government has offices, it is going to be creating a choice architecture. So I want to rule off the table objections to these two entities as such, on the ground that it's like a fish objecting to water or human beings objecting to air. The second point is that nudging takes diverse forms, and ethical abstractions can be a recipe for confusion. To figure out whether an ethical objection is correct, we need to be very specific about the nudge that we are focusing on. The third point is, if welfare is our guide, much nudging is mandatory on ethical grounds. The ethical concerns aren't neutral. They are arguing in favor of nudging. And the same thing is true with respect to autonomy. Much nudging is mandatory on ethical grounds. Okay, to avoid the trap of abstractions, I'm going to try to provide a little orientation by just describing 10 nudges. Forgive me, this is in the nature of a list, but my plea is that without some kind of account of particulars, the ethical concerns will get distracted by them. Okay, one nudge is a default rule. For example, if a rule says that you are automatically going to have the following kind of electricity, unless you want some other kind, that is a nudge. If your electricity provider is environmentally very good, but you can opt out to a cheap electricity provider that's not so good on the environmental ground, that is a nudge. If you are automatically enrolled in a retirement plan or a health care plan once you start work, that is a nudge. It ceases to be a nudge if you are forbidden from opting out, then it's a mandate. We're talking about default rules that are fully avoidable if you don't like them. Your printer undoubtedly has some default settings, single-sided or double-sided. That is a nudge. That's a default rule that is a nudge. Efforts to simplify some sort of context, for example, by making forms easier to complete and understand, or making an airport more simply navigated, that is a nudge. Simplification is a very popular current nudge. Information and disclosure are nudges. If when you buy certain products, there's information about the food, the caloric content or the nutritional content, that's a nudge. A warning is a nudge. A reminder is a nudge. If you get on your cell phone a reminder that you're going to have a doctor's appointment next week, surely there's someone in this room who has a doctor's appointment next week. Have you been reminded? If so, that's a nudge. I was given a little text message about 2 hours ago from my cell phone company saying, "You haven't paid your bill." That was a nudge. A reminder is a nudge, and often, by the way, an extremely effective nudge. I'm pleased to report I have now paid my bill. Okay, increases in ease and convenience count as nudges. So if a government alters a website or an office such that interaction with it is easier, that is a nudge. If a grocery store makes certain foods easily available because they're healthy, that is a nudge. Uses of social norms emphatically count as nudges if you tell people that the vast majority of people engage in certain behavior. That tends to reduce the behavior. So if people are told that the percentage of people in your community who smoke cigarettes is vanishingly small, then the incidence of smoking decreases still further. If you tell people in a community that the incidence of healthy eating has increased dramatically in the last 2 years, then that nudge can have a big effect. Public recognition of some kind is, of course, a nudge. Active choosing, and I want to underline this point, is a nudge. So if you are told by a provider of some service that you should be answering a question, which kind of service do you want? That is a nudge, and it can be very effective. If people are told that they have an opportunity to enroll in some program, but they don't have to make the choice if they don't want to, but it's available, that is a form of choice architecture that often can affect outcomes. There's recent data suggesting that if people are told that they have an opportunity, if they like, to become organ donors. Do you want to be an organ donor? that can have a very significant effect on the level of organ donation. Just the question, do you want to be an organ donor? Pre-commitment strategies in which people voluntarily agree in advance to a certain course of conduct, that is a nudge structure. So if the government says, if you want to enroll in some program that involves education or training, you can sign up and then you'll be committed, that is a nudge. Okay, do nudges work? Here are a few examples. There's some data, it's still coming in, suggesting that menu labels that have calorie content are leading to significant increases in healthy choices. That's maybe a bit of a surprise because the information is not that, it doesn't get your emotions going necessarily. Nonetheless, if people see the caloric content of food, there's some data suggesting there are significant increases in healthy choices. A credit card law in the United States, which has disclosure requirements in it, such that consumers are learning about the costs of not paying their bills on time. They're learning what happens if they use their credit card too much. That law is saving over $20 billion annually, some of it through nudges. Automatic enrollment in savings plans in Denmark has a much bigger effect in producing savings than significant tax incentives. As mentioned, I spent over 2 decades at the University of Chicago Law School. The sentence I just uttered is very hard for me to say because at the University of Chicago, we know it can't be true. What we know at the University of Chicago is significant tax incentives work. They have a massive effect. What we know at the University of Chicago is that automatic enrollment, that's not a very, I have to cough. This is so discouraging, these findings. The automatic enrollment in a savings plan should not have a big effect because people can opt out costlessly. Nonetheless, both parts of the sentence are true. Big tax incentives do not have such a large effect, and automatic enrollment in a savings plan does have a big effect. The reason why this finding, I think, is an extremely important finding is it has general importance, suggesting often for public or private institutions, the economic incentive, which is not a nudge, or some kind of punishment, which is not a nudge, has a smaller effect than making things automatic and simple. Okay, 3 qualifications to my conclusions. Active choosing can indeed be best, and it is a nudge, a form of choice architecture. So if you say, if you're a government, we want you to choose what kind of healthcare plan you want to enroll in, or if you say, if you're a provider of electricity, here are 5 options, tell me which one you like, sometimes that's best. Second qualification, choice architecture must be transparent, not manipulative, and subject to public scrutiny. I'm thinking now, I hadn't thought of this, I confess, until this hour, of Habermas's great book, Legitimation Crisis. And it points to, among many other things, the importance of accountability and public legitimacy. This qualification, which is a constraint on choice architecture, signals an acceptance of Habermas's concerns. Third qualification is choice architecture must not be undertaken for illicit ends. We can imagine choice architecture being used to foment discrimination or violence or destructive norms of one or another kind. There, the problem isn't with choice architecture as such, it's with the ends. The problem lies in the ends. So these are 3 qualifications to the propositions. Okay, we can see 4 concerns. What about individual rights? Do nudges violate them? Is there a problem from the standpoint of autonomy? Is there a problem from the standpoint of dignity? And what about learning? So these are background concerns that I'm going to try to address. Here's the goal restated. The 5th page of Nudge, a book There's a book called Nudge, by the way. It defines the objective as trying to influence choices in a way that will make choosers better off as judged by themselves. In the original, as judged by themselves are in italics, and they should be in italics. So consistent with Hayek's theme about the importance on focusing on choosers' well-being and on themes about autonomy that lie at the heart of the Western political tradition. People's own judgments about what makes them better off, that is the lodestar. It's usually pretty simple. When it's not, it's still the foundation for a judgment. Not, of course, when there are third-party effects, but that's a different category of problems. We're focusing on nudges that are designed to help choosers be better off. Okay, I've suggested that choice architecture is inevitable. A cafeteria, an electronics store, a cell phone, or a website nudges. There's a terrific book on website design. It's short. The title of the book is Don't Make Me Think. And the thesis of the book is good website design is very intuitive and simple. You can navigate without thinking hard. Whether or not a website takes that advice to heart, there is a choice architecture that will affect judgments. The law emphatically imposes a choice architecture. The law of contract consists in large part of default rules that establish what happens if people don't do anything. The law of property has some of the same features. Human rights law has, to some extent, default rules establishing what happens if people haven't specified what they want. And those things are a choice architecture. They have an effect on people's beliefs, their values, and their norms. If you have a default rule that says people can't be discriminated against, but under some circumstances, they can waive their rights to sue, that's a form of choice architecture. If the legal system doesn't create a right to be free from discrimination, say on the basis of sexual orientation, it doesn't create that right. That gives an employer a right, a legal right, to fire an employee because of his or her sexual orientation, free from reprisal once the discharge occurs. It's legally effective. So this is a claim, I think it's just logically so, it's not complicated, that the legal system is pervasively in the business of creating choice architecture with permissions and prohibitions. It can't be avoided. It's like water. When the law doesn't forbid a practice in an area that involves a contractual or a property relationship, it's not adequate to say the law isn't present. The law is present in the sense that it's depriving the person who's been harmed of access to any kind of remedy in the event that the harm takes place. The victim of the practice, which we're saying is legal, his or her rights are extinguished by the legal system. That might be a good thing. Those rights maybe shouldn't count as rights, but there's choice architecture inevitably there. Governments and legal systems can't avoid it. Okay, here's the World Development Report very recently. All people, rich and poor alike, sometimes make choices that do not promote their own well-being. Although mistakes can arise even after careful deliberation, people are especially prone to make choices that do not reflect their long-term interests that when they think automatically. Automatic thinking means not bringing to bear full knowledge about the dimensions and consequences of choices. Now, if you're with me, I hope you're connecting this quote from the World Bank report to the earlier quotation about calorie labels on menus, which is picking up. People automatically get the brownies or the chocolate cake or the muffin. I might be speaking autobiographically. The calorie label is designed to show that full knowledge about the dimensions and consequences of choices are brought to bear. So it's an effort to create a choice architecture that doesn't mandate anything, but that overcomes the risks associated with automatic thinking. Okay, people can also get stuck in habits, succumb to inertia, and repeatedly procrastinate despite intentions to do otherwise. Social pressures and social norms can function like taxes or subsidies on behavior, making some choices easier and others harder. I'd like to underline that last sentence, that how people in this room are dressed now, and how we will dress tomorrow, and how we will interact with one another this evening and tomorrow, is a product in part of taxes or subsidies that come from social norms. That if I came here, I actually am very comfortable in this suit, but if I came here just with blue jeans and a t-shirt, I hope that you would tax me by looking at me. Why is he doing that? That would be a tax. And we are acutely aware, even if automatically aware, of the taxes or subsidies that social norms impose. They often are decisive of outcomes, and they are a form of choice architecture. Okay, it would not be right to say that people are irrational. They are human. There's a common, it's almost gone viral in the United States and the United Kingdom, saying that behavioral economics has shown that people are irrational. That's not true. People are not irrational, but they are human. That means that they sometimes blunder in the sense that we often focus on the short term, not the long term. I misspelled the word optimistic bias here. That was not a reflection of my own optimistic bias with respect to my typing. Maybe it was, but human beings are systematically optimistic. About 80% of people think that they are safer than the average driver and less likely to be involved in a serious accident. 94% of college teachers have been found to think that they're better than the average college teacher. That can create problems with respect to health and other risks. There's a view that some people hold that what's very important in view of the risk of human error is to inculcate financial literacy and make people risk savvy. The idea is to teach people to learn about risks, to follow statistics, to learn about low-cost, diversified, passively managed index funds. Don't pick stocks. Low-cost, passively managed. But even that is not very easy to understand. Yes, I even stumbled myself over those terms, which is to suggest the problem with the enterprise, which that human beings are busy, they are focused on a number of things, and to try to make people financial or risk experts might be a very difficult enterprise. Okay. Remember the plea of Huxley's hero, the savage. I don't want comfort. Instead, I want God, poetry, danger, freedom, goodness, and sin. Okay, what I want now is try to specify what might be the beating heart behind those words. Okay, first, when do those objections make sense? Do they make sense when people are given information about calories or the nutritional content of food? I hope not. Do they make sense when people are asked to say what they want? Is that interfering with people's autonomy? I hope not. When people are reminded of an appointment or a bill, is there any intrusion on their choice-making humanity? I hope you're thinking not. When people are presented with a default rule that they can reject, is there any problem from the standpoint of choice-making? I hope not. So this rhetorical question is meant to suggest that once we get beyond abstractions and start engaging concretely on particular nudges, the ethical concerns start to weaken. But to get at that, I myself have to get more concrete. Okay, a GPS is a nudge. This person is being nudged. If you don't like the choice architecture suggested by the GPS, you can ignore it. It's a nudge, but it completely preserves freedom. Here's my only scandalous slide. This is indeed a urinal. It's a very famous and amazing urinal. it should be a painting, don't you think? Not just a urinal, because it has a lesson in it. This is the urinal in the Netherlands airport. That's a painted fly in the urinal. That's a form of choice architecture. I hope I'm not embarrassing anyone to say that the result of painting the fly was to reduce spillage in the airport by 44%. Apparently, men can't help but aim at the fly once they see it. That's a nudge. In the United States, we created a food plate, which is simple and clear. It's a nudge. It says, make half your plate fruits and vegetables, replacing this old food pyramid, which is very complicated and difficult. There's a person, gender unclear, marching to the top of the pyramid. There are these stripes. Can you think what are you supposed to eat? Does this tell you what you're supposed to eat? Not really. It's not helpful. So this is a nudge that replaces an unhelpful nudge. Okay, first problem, paternalism. It is true that libertarian paternalism is still paternalism. For those who are concerned for historical and other reasons with government intrusion on people's choice-making capacities, even libertarian paternalism might be a cause for concern. I think to get a sense of the strength of the concern, we need to make a distinction. Some forms of paternalism are soft and others are hard. If a government tells you, you must buy a fuel-efficient car, that's hard. If the government tells you, here's the fuel efficiency of the set of cars that you're considering, that's soft. Soft paternalism is freedom-preserving, hard paternalism isn't. Skeptics about paternalism are concerned first and foremost, I think, about hard paternalism. Soft paternalism at least diminishes, doesn't it, the worry. The second distinction's a little more subtle and I think more important. Some forms of paternalism are directed at making people's ends change. You might say with respect to someone who wants to go on a certain life path, say they want to go to law school. That's a bad choice. That is a form of ends paternalism. A form of means paternalism is one that says, if you want to go to law school, well, you'd better fill out the application forms. That fully protects people's choices of ends. So we can see, can we not, that paternalism becomes least objectionable if it is soft and focused on means. I hope that's convincing. That the negative aura of the word paternalism starts to dissipate once we see the form of paternalism that we're embracing as focused on soft and means-oriented. Insofar as libertarian paternalism is soft and oriented towards means, we might say that the real focus is on navigability. I don't know if there's a German equivalent for the word. It's a good English word, navigability, because sometimes life is easily navigated, sometimes not so much. If a private institution or the government makes life more easily navigated, we can see it as a form of soft paternalism, but it's not a problem. If welfare is our master concept, certain forms of paternalism, those that are oriented at people's own ends and that are soft, are justified or required on welfare grounds. When President Clinton opened up the technology that made the GPS available, that allowed a form of paternalism from that little voice that you hear from the GPS, but that wasn't an intrusion on welfare, it increased welfare. It also increased our autonomy, didn't it? Many nudges, those are inform us and make us more able to achieve our own ends. Those are acceptable, even mandatory on autonomy grounds. Autonomy requires informed choices, but it does not require choices everywhere. If we had to make choices everywhere, then we would quickly be swallowed up by choice making. You'd still be in a store probably buying your cell phone, because you'd have to make a series of choices which are very time-consuming to make. Time management has a close relationship to autonomy. Often people's goal is to free up their own time for their own concerns, what most matters to them. And insofar as nudges both preserve freedom of choice and promote time management, then they are desirable on ethical grounds. Okay, second problem, manipulation. This, as I suggest, is the most interesting. Some nudges can be manipulative. It's a complex concept and it needs definition. On one view, an intervention counts as manipulative if it is attacking people's unconscious or subconscious and not triggering their deliberative capacities. That's one understanding of manipulation. So if the government doesn't try to engage citizens consciously and deliberatively in choices, but instead goes after them subliminally, we might think the government is manipulating people. That's a very fair concern. An institution of propaganda is in the business often of manipulation, and it's illegitimate for that reason. It's not engaging people's cognitive cognition. That's redundant. It's not engaging people's cognition. It's engaging their visceral capacities. Okay, they shouldn't be. If nudges have this characteristic, they shouldn't be. They should be transparent and unhidden and fully subject to public scrutiny and review. So the plea with respect to this objection is that we need to specify the concept. More work needs to be done on that, insofar as an actor is going behind people's cognitive back through an intervention. It's fair, I think, to make the accusation of manipulativeness. That's a problem. It should be avoided. And there should be a requirement of transparency and openness and full subjection to public scrutiny and review. What about dignity? As noted, a concern about certain forms of intervention is that they can be humiliating or disrespectful. There's a wonderful book by Avishai Margalit called The Decent Society. If you know the book. The book Margalit urges that a just society is very hard to achieve. Justice is a very demanding idea. A decent society is easier to achieve. It's much less demanding. A decent society doesn't humiliate people. They don't feel that they're being treated disrespectfully. And that is manageable in a society that has pockets of injustice. Okay, some people who are concerned about nudging are concerned about dignity. But is a GPS humiliating? Is a warning? Is a reminder? No. Information doesn't treat people disrespectfully. It tries to promote their own agency. The same is true with warnings and reminders. If people are asked to make active choices, that's a gesture in favor of their dignity. It's not an insult to their dignity. If people are given default rules in a plan for Social Security, or a plan for mortgages, or a plan for their cell phones, is there disrespect? It's hard to see why, isn't it? So long as people can opt out if they don't like it. It is true that there is a risk of error on the part of the choice architect. That is, the person who's designing the choice architecture might make mistakes. That may argue for active choosing. But it's not a suggestion that dignity is a trump card against nudges. So I think for those of you who are interested in the suggestion that dignity raises problems for nudging. The challenge is to specify a nudge that offends dignity. Now, of course, we could hypothetically design nudges that are designed to treat certain ethnic groups with disrespect or to entrench sex discrimination through nudging. That would be a violation of a norm of dignity. But the problem there wouldn't be nudges as such. It would be the dignity-reducing feature of the particular nudge. I hope that's clear. Fourth problem, coercion. Nudges preserve freedom of choice. They are not coercive. They enable people to go their own way. Nonetheless, it's true that nudges often stick. If you set your printer default rule to double-sided printing tomorrow, you will find that you are doing a lot of double-sided printing, even in circumstances in which you think that was a mistake. I want a single-sided that time. That suggests that nudges often work and in a way can exploit cognitive biases. In this case, inertia. That's why the default rule sticks in this case. But what's the alternative? Life without default rules isn't imaginable, is it? If every time you use your printer you have to think, what are the settings I want to put on this printing? Life in your office will be too long. You need default rules. Fifth problem, who's the choice architect? This is a common question, and I think it's meant as an objection. Who is the choice architect? It's said as a kind of accusation. Well, if we lower the temperature on the conversation, many people, teachers of law are choice architects. Parents are choice architects. Bosses certainly are. Computer companies and cell phone companies, stores, government, providers of energy, doctors and lawyers and engineers, they are all choice architects. That's the answer. So the mystery is, what is this question about, really? Why is it said as with an accusatory tone? Courts that devise the rules of contract and property, they are choice architects. That's inevitable. Okay, maybe what the question is about is distrust of choice architects. And that's important. Cautionary note. That's fair. That's why markets and democracy are essential safeguards against foolish or malevolent choice architects. You know the finding from economist Amartya Sen that no nation in the history of the world with democratic elections and a free press has ever experienced a famine? It's a remarkable finding. It's about the choice architecture that democracy and self-government themselves are. When there is a famine, it's not just a function of food scarcity. It's the government is not responding adequately to the prospect of food scarcity. And if the people who work for the government are going to lose their jobs if they don't respond adequately to that risk, then they are going to respond to the risk. And that's what the evidence shows. Self-government is a safeguard against confused or malevolent choice architects. It's not a perfect safeguard. There's a domain where market ordering is much preferred to democratic ordering, and that's because markets are also a great safeguard against bad choice architecture. A cell phone company or a shoe company that provides terrible choice architecture for cell phones or shoes, they will go out of business pretty soon. Are you starting to think that I may have an infinite number of problems and you're going to be here till 4 in the morning? That's true. Sorry. Okay, sixth problem, illicit ends. Some nudges are indeed illicit because they have illicit goals. They may just be designed to entrench the current government. They may just be designed to help interest groups. They may be designed to promote discrimination. They may be designed to promote unfreedom broadly understood. I was in China about 20-odd years ago, and I taught a course on American administrative law. And at the end of the course, I asked them, and they were great. They were in their 30s and 40s. They weren't college students. They were professionals. And I asked them, would you write a short paper, it could even be 2 pages, saying either what China can learn from the United States in terms of administrative law, or what the United States can learn from China in terms of administrative law. Take your pick. And only 2 of the 35 students wrote papers, which was extremely puzzling because they were very nice people and I didn't give them any other assignments. And I asked them, the 2, by the way, both said that China could learn a lot from the United States and the United States had nothing to learn from China. And I asked the students after, what was that about? Why did the 33 of you not write your papers? And they said, well, those 2 aren't in the Communist Party. The rest of us are. And while we don't know that we would face penalties, we are being effectively nudged not to write a paper for you. So the problem there is not the fact that the Chinese government at the time was nudging people not to express themselves. The problem was that there was a culture of unfreedom. So the difficulty lies in illicit ends, not in nudging as such. And I want to underline this, I think, obvious point, which is that some of the concerns about imaginable choice architecture aren't concerns about choice architecture. They're concerns about the particular choice architecture and the goals that animate it. Okay, 7th problem, learning. In his great essay on liberty, John Stuart Mill says, first, the individual knows better than any outsider what is going to help that individual's life go better. Mill's argument is first and foremost an argument about people's epistemic advantage over outsiders. You know what you like. Your government doesn't. Even your friends probably don't, as well as you do. But Mill made another argument, I think a more heartfelt argument actually, which was that choice-making is like a muscle, and it develops through being exercised. If you don't make choices for yourself, the muscle tends to atrophy, and people weaken. The quotation from Brave New World can be understood as a very vivid example of Mill's argument, where when the savage says, I want sin, what he's really saying is not, I want to do wrong, but I want to exercise my choice-making muscle. Now, there's actually data in London suggesting that London cab drivers without a GPS experience a change in their neurological function, which tracks the fact that they can navigate the very difficult streets that London consists of. With a GPS, they wouldn't have that neurological change. Default rules also can be worse than active choosing on the ground that people aren't exercising a choice-making muscle. So there are domains such as the right to vote, maybe the right to choose who you date, who you marry, who are your friends. Those are things where there's learning, and you don't want people to be defaulted in any respect into a certain set of outcomes. This is an ethical argument for a certain kind of choice architecture which prizes active choosing and which is skeptical of nudges that aren't that. But do we wish that the GPS had never been invented? Probably not. When the printing press was first created, it is true that many prominent people said this is very bad because people won't memorize large passages of text anymore. They'll lose that capacity. The printing press is unfortunate. The prediction was true. Fewer people memorize large passages now with the printing press. But the claim that the printing press on balance was bad is not correct. So the point is that learning is very important. What we need to do is identify domains in which learning has sufficient importance that the right choice architecture is one that increases it. There are other domains where the right choice architecture doesn't, because learning is not necessary and is an intrusion on both welfare and autonomy. Okay, individual rights. Most nudges, remember my list of 10, have no adverse effect on rights. If you are warned that if you swim in a certain ocean, you should be careful because the current is strong, that doesn't infringe on your rights. Some nudges help to promote rights and make their realization possible. Nudges that make people aware of their legal entitlements, and there are a lot of such nudges, are indispensable, and they are rights promoting. We do need a lot more thinking on the relationship between good choice architecture and freedom of speech, freedom of religion, self-government, and equality. Much more thinking should be devoted to those questions. The work that's been done to date on choice architecture and nudging and those 4 very important values has just scratched the surface. Some imaginable nudges, it's true, could violate rights because they could have illicit ends, but my little song tonight, they are unacceptable for that reason, not because they are nudges. It's not really a song. It's more like a slogan. Okay, a next to final question. I have 2 questions to end. Indirectly related to ethics. What is the most precious commodity that members of the human species have? A commodity that Hayek and Mill did not sufficiently consider? And it does have a relationship to the ethical issues. The answer isn't love. Sorry, the answer isn't love. Mill considered that a lot. Hayek, not so much. But that's not what I'm talking about. Time. Time. All of us are finite, we're mortal, and a choice architecture that is built on the temporal limitations members of the human species face, that's good. From the standpoint of welfare, that's great. From the standpoint of autonomy, that's important. A final question directly related to ethics and welfare. What is the one thing whose importance public officials, lawyers, doctors most often neglect? There is one thing, my own experience in government and law, and very occasionally with doctors, there's one thing they most often neglect, and these are my final words. Peace of mind. Thanks.
So there's opportunity to... Is it working? No, it's not. So there's opportunity for Q&A, for debate. As this is a Verfassungsblog forum, we have that is streamed online. We also have participants that are virtual. And so some people, Hannah will bring us some questions that might have come up there. But I might start to ask the audience if there are some questions. And if someone wants the translation, I'm happy to translate. So if someone has a German question, I'll be happy. Isabel.
Thank you very much for your very illuminating talk. My name is Isabel Feichner. I'm from Frankfurt. I have a question, first of all, concerning your definition of nudging and choice architecture. So in one of the first slides, you said it's about steering in directions that someone thinks is a good idea. And then later you made the strong point that it helps choosers be better off as identified by themselves? So there I find already it's a bit ambivalent whether it's really about the choosers or about somebody who thinks something is a good idea. And I'd like to take up your example with the calorie indication on foodstuff. So there you make very easily the link between consuming less calories to health. But health is very complex, I think. But still here and I would say it's then not just about information and leaving choice open, but it also suggests that consuming lower calories will make you healthier. So I think in many of these examples, I would say that the aim might require some more collective engagement and cannot be reached just by individual choice. I think that's particularly apparent with health, because we might need different production cycles to live healthily if we have a particular conception of health. Yeah, this is a common question whether this is not a bit too simple.
Okay, great. So thank you. So there are two different questions there. The first, I think I have a more straightforward answer to than the second. So the first question is there a tension between this slide, which defines nudges as looking at choosers themselves, judging themselves as being better off, and the choice architect who's doing some steering in the direction that the choice architect thinks is best. Okay, I think I wasn't clear enough. So this is the key slide. So the choice architect should be thinking, what will make choosers better off as they themselves judge matters? So if the choice architect thinks, I believe that people would be better off eating less delicious food but more healthy food, but choosers believe, I believe we want a more delicious mix of foods. I don't just want to be healthy, I want to be happy. Then the choice architect should defer to the judgments of the chooser. So the chooser has priority. Now this will introduce some complications in cases where we don't know what choosers judge as making them better off, and we have to figure out what information do choosers have such that we honor their choice. But I think those are important footnotes to the main idea, which is the focus is on choosers, not on choice architects in terms of what is going to promote people's welfare. So if you have a choice architect who thinks, I think everyone should be of a certain religion, that'll make them better off, that's not part of the nudging project, because choosers may disagree with that. They don't want that religion. So that's the answer to that question. In terms of the calorie content, it's a great question. So let's just stipulate that high-calorie foods have some consequences that aren't good for health, and that those consequences can reasonably be traded off by consumers against other goods, including price and deliciousness. So I'd rather have a 300-calorie meal that's inexpensive and delicious than a 200-calorie meal that's expensive and doesn't taste very good. So this is a very mundane idea I'm offering, that the calorie label gives choosers something that they care about. It tells them something they care about. It bears on their health. Now, it's true that calories are a crude proxy for healthiness. So you might care how much salt, how much sugar, other things than calories. And ideally, the disclosure strategy would tell people everything that matters to them that they don't already know about. But what I'm not sure about is the more sustained engagement that you mentioned. What Oscar Wilde said about socialism, the problem with socialism is it would take too many evenings, I think is good policy advice, that engagement with people about their food choices, unless they have a serious health problem, if you're government, that's pretty intrusive. And if you're a store, it's pretty irritating. So tell people things that are simple and relevant, and then let them decide. That's the goal. And you're looking a little skeptical. I hope we'll talk later. I'm not sure whether what the content of the skepticism is. It could be that calorie labels are just too crude a measure for what people should care about. And then the question is that true as a matter of science? I don't think it's true as a matter of science. I think they're kind of crude, but it's important. How many calories? That matters. If the question is that people's food concerns are more complicated and rich than can be captured in any label, that's true. But then let them, as a first approximation, let them make their rich judgments once they know relevant facts.
Gerd Wagner.
I was also concerned by the broadness of your concept of nudge. When I read your book, I thought I fairly knew what you were talking about. Today you had a whole menu which included basically any regulatory or legislative tool except mandatory rules. And even mandatory rules are, you could phrase as a nudge with a high price for opting out. So it's, really, nothing is really mandatory. So is it really wise to make the concept so broad and to include the full set of policy options? And one example that struck me was default rules. The common law, or what we call private law, contract law, property law, consists of default rules, has always consisted of them. And the way to justify them was to say that one supposes that the majority of subjects would choose the solution that is embodied in the rule, would they think or negotiate about it? And if that's paternalism, that is a new concept of paternalism to me. I thought that was sort of affecting people's choices in a cost-effective way, not so much of regulating paternalistically. And so I want to ask, what is really what's the paternalistic side to it?
Okay, good.
And going further, I think in taking the argument with the calories a step further, one must acknowledge, I think, that not everybody shares the concern about calories or even health. And so for the minority, it may be that doesn't care, that they're harassed by these rules, and for them, it's not paternalistic in the sense that you help them be better off as judged by themselves, but you sort of force them constantly to opt out of something which they reject because they don't think it's good for themselves. One last thing, I think it is true to say that the nudges are soft on the people who make the choices, much softer than mandatory rules, of course, but they may be quite hard on others, on third parties. If, for instance, you make a rule that favors choices of low-calorie products, then you hit hard, maybe, if it's effective, the producers of French fries, hamburgers, and other high-calorie products. Now, for them, even in particular, if it's an effective nudge, for them, the effect of regulation through nudges may be as hard, even harder maybe, than direct prohibition of certain foodstuffs or, let's say, smoking or something. And doesn't that raise the same concerns in terms of legitimacy as other tools of regulatory intervention?
Okay, so that's great. Thank you for that. There are about 6 points there, and I think I identified 6, but I didn't write them down. So I'll go through the ones I remember. I won't go through them adequately, but I'll give it a first crack. Okay, so first question is whether mandates, the definition of nudge is so capacious that even mandates become nudges. And the answer is no. That anything that imposes significant economic costs on behavior is not a nudge. So if you have something that says if you don't engage in certain behavior, you have to pay a €50 tax, that's not a nudge. If you have something that says that you have to pay a very small criminal fine, say 20 euros, that's a nudge. So a nudge is something that applies no or close to no material costs on choices. Now, things can get a little bit complicated once we start talking about psychic costs. But as a first approximation, let's say the line between a nudge and a not nudge involves economic costs on the chooser. So that's point one. On the capaciousness of the definition of nudge, you're right, it is capacious. I hope it's consistent with the definition of the book. So the idea that a warning is a nudge, a reminder is a nudge, a disclosure requirement is a nudge, certainly a default rule is a nudge. That's a canonical or iconic nudge, a default rule. All those are nudges. And it is true there's a large set of policy tools that qualify as nudges, but they share something in common, which is they're fully freedom-preserving. They are steering people in a direction that's thought to be best by the person who devised them, but in a way that fully maintains freedom of choice for the chooser. So that's the definition. You want to ask, and I think this is the third point, it's connected to the second, is whether contract law default rules count as nudges. I urge yes, because they establish what happens if what people do nothing. You say no, because default rules are standardly justified in the law of contract on the ground that they mimic what people would do if they actually said. Okay, insofar as what you say is correct there, that I hope this isn't too technical for this group, but a rule of contract that might say, suppose people haven't specified the time of performance. We'll say the time of performance if you have, let's say, ants in your apartment and you're trying to get an exterminator to get rid of the ants. 2 weeks before the exterminator comes is too late. So the exterminator might have to come within 24 hours if you haven't specified. And that would be because that's what most people would bargain their way to. That would be the default. That would be one way to approach that question. You're right that we could say that a default rule that mimics what people would do is not paternalistic. It's not even libertarian paternalism. It's just straight tracking behavior. Whether that's correct, I think it's not clearly not correct, but it's not clearly correct. And the reason is that, as you know, default rules tend to stick. They can shape preferences. And so there is going to be a preference-shaping paternalistic feature, even to a default rule that is reasonably justified on the ground that it's tracking people's behavior. So those are on the definitional points. I think there's probably at least one I missed. So maybe, okay, we can continue.
Chris McCran.
Thank you also for a wonderful lecture. And I'm looking forward to the discussion over the next few days. Could I just pick up the point about the relationship between active choosing and default rules that you mentioned earlier on? And I'm puzzled when active choosing has to be preferred over default rules as a matter of principle. And I was trying to think of an example. So maybe this is an example of where the issue arises. Let's say government wants to have a decline in the criminal rate, so the rate at which people commit crime. And they think, or they consult you, about what to do about that. And at the moment, the default rule is a presumption of innocence when somebody is arrested. And I assume that's a default rule in your terms. So why wouldn't it be right for the government to change the default rule simply to a presumption of guilt if, in order to preserve liberty and choice, you were allowed to opt out of that, of course, and decide that you are also going to declare yourself to be innocent, right? But the default rule switches. Is there anything in principle in your system that would argue against that?
Okay, good. So let's talk maybe in a less inflammatory context about the choice between active choosing and default rules. So we'll get to the inflammatory, I promise. So suppose the question is whether for your electricity provider, you should get a notice every year saying which do you want, or you should be defaulted into one. Or suppose the question is whether certain terms of your mortgage with your if you're buying a house, do you make active choices about 50 things or just about 7? I think a good way into the question active choosing or default rules is to think about the costs of decisions and the costs of errors. The economic analysis of law, in my view, has had one great idea. It's had many good ideas. This is its great idea. If you're stuck, think about the costs of decisions and the costs of errors. If you have an area where if people made active choices, the decisional burdens they would face would be very high and they'd make a lot of mistakes, then you don't want to force them to be active choosers. So when you buy your cell phone, it probably has a lot of default settings that you didn't select. That's fine. If you have an area where people are going to a restaurant, they know what they like, it's kind of fun to decide what to order, then the costs of decisions aren't very high. In fact, that's actually a benefit. And if they had a default menu at many restaurants, you'd get a less wonderful meal than if you get to choose. So in many areas, I think the legal system or the market has an intuitive appreciation of the importance of inquiring into decision costs and error costs. So when you choose, your friends, there's no default friend. It's the friends you've chosen. It's because it's kind of fun to choose your friends, and there are fewer mistakes if you choose them rather than if some random person is by default your friend. So choice of cost of errors, costs of decisions as our little framework. On the presumption of innocence, the way that works in the law, as I understand it, I'm not a criminal law expert, is not you get to say I'm guilty and to opt out. Just as a presumption of guilt wouldn't mean you get to say I'm innocent, opt out. It doesn't trigger a requirement of words. It's instead in the nature of a burden of proof placed on someone. So what the presumption of innocence means is that the government has to overcome it through proof. What a presumption of guilt would mean is that the accused would have to overcome the presumption through proof. And probably something like a cost of error framework would provide some, though not all, of the picture of why a presumption of innocence is a lot better than a presumption of guilt. In a system of presumption of guilt, you will have a society where a lot of people are going to be going to jail who didn't do anything wrong. And that is going to have a lot of social welfare effects that are bad. Not only for them, but for all of us who are fearful that if accused, we are presumed guilty. It's up to us to prove. In a system of presumed innocence, you not only have the welfare gains, and here I'm taking a maybe counterintuitive Benthamite rather than Kantian line, but on the Benthamite line, to be imprisoned is really bad, and to think you might be accused and therefore have to overcome a presumption that you're guilty, that's also really bad. You could have a Kantian line about individual dignity and respect for persons, which would be maybe the more intuitive way into this problem, and say that for this sort of issue, which is a choice architecture issue, you're quite right, but it's not the kind of issue I'm talking about where it's choice architecture that's steering people in directions that preserves their freedom of choice but makes their own lives go better. It's a different kind of problem, the presumption of innocence, presumption of guilt problem, where you have someone who maybe did something against the law, and the question who has to prove what before there's a jail sentence. And I think it's clear that a legal system, and there kind of are some in the world, that have the functional equivalent of a presumption of guilt, that's on every dimension that human beings should care about. That's bad.
Könnten Sie bitte aufstehen, wenn Sie eine Frage stellen? Alle?
Thank you for a very engaging talk. I want to ask you about the side effects or third-party effects that I think you've kind of skirted a little bit in the beginning. When you say the standard, or when you say it will make choosers better off as judged by themselves, I'm wondering what the standard of better off is, and whether that will always be an individual standard or whether this might also be a collective standard, so it will make everybody, including this person, better off overall versus individually. So this is about sort of the Pareto optimum versus the individual optimum, possibly. I'm also wondering about stigma. Nudging might promote stigma towards certain population groups. If we think of the soda ban in New York City, that was discussed as this attacks a certain high caloric type of food or drink in this case that is typically consumed by certain population groups that are perceived as lazy or not fully capable of exercising autonomy. So what about that from an ethical viewpoint? And finally, nudging might save me time, but for example, if I complete a German tax form, it will have two columns. One is the taxpayer / husband, and the other is the wife. So in my marriage, I'm the taxpayer, I am sort of the earner, but I have to be the column of the wife. So that might save a lot of people time, but it also entrenches social norms that I personally might find harmful. Is that a problem of illicit ends, or is that somewhere in between? Thank you.
Okay, I'm doing some choice architecture for myself about remembering these various points. Okay, so if there's a form that says husband and it's sex discriminatory, it's probably right, first approximation, to say that the sex discrimination norm is decisive as against a discriminatory time-saving device. So if you add something, a society, you know, the United States, say, that presumed people were Caucasian and that in certain forms they could mark African American if they're not, that would be discriminatory. And it would take an account of why a discrimination norm would trump the time saving, but probably if we thought a lot, that account would be convincing. Now you could imagine hard cases maybe where the time saving is so massive and the number of people who are discriminated against is so small that there's a discussion to be had about what trumps what, but those are exotic cases. So basically, I'm with you that a choice architecture that is sex discriminatory stands impugned for that reason. In terms of the stigma of the soda ban, a couple of things to say about that. The soda ban itself was the Mayor Bloomberg who said you couldn't sell very big soda. That was not a nudge. That's a mandate. That didn't just inform people. That said people couldn't buy big sodas. Now, whether that would be justified might turn on an analysis of the health effects and the costs, but it went beyond a nudge. The stigma issue, I wonder, in this and some other contexts, the sex discrimination context is one where we don't have to use an abstract word like stigma. We can use, I think, a more concrete word like sex equality. The word stigma, in some contexts, it may suffer from the problem that it's a little nuclear, the word stigma. You know, the word stigma calls up something really horrible. But the question is whether that association that the word stigma has is warranted in a case in which the mayor of a city is saying we don't want people to get sick because they're drinking too much unhealthy food. So what I wonder is whether the stigma idea is really the right one or whether it's too large, and whether the right question isn't instead for the soda ban, is this really helping people's health? How much? What kind of costs and burdens does it put on people? To your point about the fact that some nudges can impose costs, even if they retain freedom of choice. But I didn't write down your first point. Would you remind me? It was a good. Yes. Okay. That. I think of all three of your points are important. That's probably the most important. So for the choosers, the idea is we're going to be extremely individualistic. We're going to be annoyingly individualistic. That if the question is whether there should be a disclosure of something involving energy efficiency of clothes washers or warnings for people about swimming in dangerous places or about cigarettes or reminders for people about doctor's appointments or late bills, the chooser is what we want to focus on. Chooser, that's it. Now, that could get complicated for reasons that you suggest. Certainly, if the chooser's well-being, as judged by the chooser's criteria of his or her well-being. So this is an answer to your great question. Whose account of well-being are we using? It's the chooser's account we're using. And so if the chooser thinks my well-being is one in which I'm praying 7 hours a day and not thinking much about food, or my well-being is one in which I'm a gourmet, that's, in a free society, that's decisive in both cases. It would get hard if the chooser's choice ended up hurting others. So a case of environmental decisions can create a complexity if the chooser's, let's say, opting for the environmentally inferior but low-cost energy source imposes costs on third parties in the form of air pollution. Then we have to do an all things considered social welfare analysis. And then the framework on the last sentence here turns out to be really important. So social welfare analysis in the end is going to be necessary where the chooser's decisions affect others. And that's, I haven't been focusing on that problem, but it's a very important problem where you might want nudges that are designed to prevent adverse effects on third parties. Like you might want a double-sided printing default for that reason. Not to protect the user of the printer, but to protect against excessive resource use.
Let me just take a question from the internet now.
Well, thank you very much. I'm not representing my own opinion here, but some people who have followed us online. So one of the people who have followed us is Anne van Aken, who probably many of you know here, a professor from St. Gallen. And she is interested, actually, it's probably related to Nora Marquardt's question, because she's interested in a distinction. She suggests there is a distinction between paternalistic nudges and non-paternalistic nudges. So paternalistic nudges are for the individual's welfare, whereas non-paternalistic nudges are nudges introduced for the society's welfare or reducing externalities needs to be made for ethical as well as legal reasons. And she says, so for instance, the refrigerator example would be one of a non-paternalistic nudge because it is all about environmental protection and society welfare. But then she argues when it comes to paternalistic nudges, when the sake of the individual's welfare is concerned, there must be higher standards, especially when it comes to constitutional review. Therefore, her question is, why is this distinction of aims of nudges not made? Wouldn't that be important? And perhaps related to that, because one of the commentators on Twitter noted how we nudged them into tweeting by frequently displaying the hashtag to be used. Yeah. We have a question from Stas Wagts from Wageningen University, and she asks, what is meant by nudge for good? Good for whom? Which is essentially a similar question. For the individual or for the society, or perhaps for the market, or for whom?
Okay, that's very helpful. So the focus in these remarks were on nudges that had a paternalistic feature in the sense that they're maintaining freedom of choice, but trying to make a chooser better off. The case of the non-paternalistic nudges does deserve separate treatment. But notice, if you would, the following feature of those situations. If you have effects on third parties, the standard remedy is not nudge, it's a corrective tax or a mandate. So if someone is engaging in activity that imposes a harm on third parties, then we're in the standard kind of easy, familiar problem where a nudge remedy isn't the natural one, it's stop the harm. Yes? So the non-paternalistic nudge, at first glance, that's not where the action is. That's where we have a repertoire of understandings. So if you have companies that are engaging in pollution, or if you have some kind of collective action problem that is resulting in, let's say, workplace safety problems, or companies are selling trucks to people which are hurting third parties in accidents, then that's something we've long known, I think, how to handle. That's standard regulatory thinking works there. So the idea of non-paternalistic nudges, I thought the direction that was being gone was something like the earlier question about default rules, which may be nudges but don't seem self-evidently to be paternalistic. The reason the question is really good, notwithstanding what I just said, if you're with me. So what I'm suggesting is non-paternalistic nudges, meaning nudges in cases of third-party effects. We don't want just nudges. We want corrective taxes or mandates or economic incentives there. The question is good because you might say you might want a nudge to accompany or possibly to substitute for the standard tool. So you might think that we want everyone to have health care. This is a controversial view, but one view is we want everyone else to have health care, health insurance, because if some people don't, they're going to impose costs on the rest of us who are going to be paying for them. That's a view. Now, if that view is right, you might think, well, you want some nudges to make sure everyone has health insurance. Automatic enrollment might be one, reminders and education might be others. So you could have them nudges in cases where you're really trying to protect third parties. And surely we do need to focus quite a bit on that. In the United Kingdom, there's been a lot of interest in increasing organ donation and decreasing delinquent tax paying. Make sure people pay their taxes and get people to be organ donors. And that's not to protect the delinquent taxpayer or the organ donor. It's to protect other taxpayers, and it's to protect people who need the organs. And there are nudges that do that. So that's important and true. So it's a nice distinction. Okay, so there's an analysis to be done of non-paternalistic nudges, meaning nudges that are designed to protect harms to third parties. In terms of the ethics of those nudges, I might be missing something, but I think those aren't hard ethical questions, are they? Those are easy ethical questions. We want to prevent the harm to third parties. We need to have good tools, and the question is more a pragmatic one, which is good, rather than an ethical question, what are the limits of consumer sovereignty or dignity? No dignity problem if you are nudging people to not to commit crimes to third parties. Okay, on the nudge for good, that's a little abstract. So the question's right, and I hope I didn't have a slide that said nudge for good. There we go. There's our test. Influence choices in a way that will make choosers better off as judged by themselves. Now, there can be complexities there, where if people have, a conception of a good life, which is clearly making themselves miserable, either because they have mental illness maybe, or there's some problem, that would complicate that. But basically, that's the idea. And when there are third-party effects, nudge for good, the nudge for good framework in case of third-party effects, maximize net benefits, meaning take the benefits, then subtract the costs, choose the approach that has the highest possible number. I don't think that's get any of you wanting to march under some banner in favor of cost-benefit analysis, but the idea is that we're concerned about the human consequences of what's done. At least that's a lot of what we're concerned about, maybe not everything. And if you have a rule involving, let's say, occupational safety that is going to save 200 lives a year, that's a very high benefit. If you have an alternative approach that's going to save 20 lives a year, you're leaving 180 dead people not saved. And that's a very serious loss. So if you can have a nudge that can save the 180, that's worth it, unless the costs of doing that are really, really high. Now, how high is too high? Well, then we have to start talking about some hard questions about valuation.
I have a hopefully short question. Argue a nudge works because the majority of the addressees won't fully counteract it at the moment when it is inflicted on them. Doesn't that very statement imply that nudges have a specific autonomy cost, and that the very fact that the end is okay doesn't finish the constitutional debate?
Okay, I don't agree with the premise. So, but the premise is widely believed to be true. So let's underline it, and then I'll explain why I don't believe it. The premise is that nudges work when people won't counteract it when it is inflicted on them. If you're given a reminder that your bill is due, or you have a doctor's appointment, or if you want to sign up for some program, you'd better do so in the next month, that doesn't work because people won't counteract it when it's inflicted on them. It works because people see it and say, oh, that's relevant to me. If you have a GPS that says, the way to get from Berlin to Munich, if you're driving, is this way, that's the fastest, I think it's not right to say it works if people won't counteract it when it is inflicted on them. That's too strong, because people are driving themselves and they can choose their own preferred route. So the question is, for what kind of nudge is that sentence correct? If you are told that the social norm in your community is to avoid using alcohol to excess, that's just how it is in your community, without imposing any kind of sanction on you if you get badly drunk the next week, the word counteract seems to suggest more affirmative, you must do something in response, than the statement of the social norm requires. You can just read it and say, I like to drink. It's not against the law. So I'm not sure what's meant by the nudge word. There's no autonomy problem with being told that this is the fastest route to get to Munich, with being told if you don't sign up for this good program in the next month, you're going to lose your chance. So that's increasing your autonomy. If the nudge says, hashtag whatever this is, people can say, tragic and almost impossible as it is to think, people can say, I'm not interested in that topic. I want to be focusing on something else. So it doesn't have the autonomy-inflicting character that you're describing. If you are arriving somewhere and someone says, what do you want in your loan? Here are 6 hard questions. How do you answer the 6? It's not as if something's going to happen to you unless you counteract it when it's inflicted on you. So I think the problem with the premise is that, if you'll permit, is that it has a picture. It's almost like a Wittgensteinian problem. It's caught in the grip of a picture of a nudge. And I don't know what that picture is. The closest I can get to the picture that the question has is a default rule, where if the default rule says, here's your cell phone, you want to see mine? iPhone 6? Here's my cell phone. It has various default settings. They stick unless I counteract them. That's accurate. But is that a problem from the standpoint of autonomy? If when I bought this cell phone, I had to specify all the settings, I wouldn't have enjoyed buying the cell phone very much. It would have been a nightmare. It would have intruded on my autonomy. So maybe here's a way of getting at, I'm spending a lot of time on the question because I think you're onto something that I probably don't understand sufficiently and that is widely held. There's an economist at MIT named Esther Duflo who wrote a book called Poor Economics. She's not criticizing the economics provision. She's talking about poverty. And one of the themes in her book is, as captured in an oral statement she made on a book tour of some kind, she said, we're used to thinking of poor people as not taking responsibility for their own lives. So that's not true. Stop thinking about the poor people as not taking responsibility for their own lives and start thinking instead of all the ways that people who are not poor have their lives taken care of for them. If you are poor and you do nothing, you are on the wrong track. If you are not poor and you do nothing, you're on the right track. Now that's true in the sense that if you live in a well-functioning society, you're not poor, the air is clean, crime rate is low, you have a social welfare program that works, that you don't have to struggle to get access to, et cetera, et cetera. So the only cases where this won't counteract when it's inflicted on you, I think, is the default rule. That's the only one. But is that an infringement on your autonomy? From the standpoint of autonomy, is a default rule a problem? Try to live in a world without default rules and see how much autonomy you have. A day there would be a nightmare.
One short, intelligent, and inspiring last question is very welcome. So who volunteers? Matthias Goldmann.
Matthias Goldmann from Heidelberg. Let's see whether I can live up to that standard. My question is, just going off from where you ended, isn't the question really, what is autonomy? Or, to point to that last phrase, as judged by themselves, isn't the question whether we read it ex ante or ex post? Ex ante meaning that preferences are stable, so that nudging wouldn't necessarily influence our autonomy. It would just make us live it better. But if that is really true, I'm not really sure whether that concept is true, because nudging is so intrusive, or it influences us so well. If you read it ex post, then it certainly influences your autonomy, but that would be a different concept of autonomy, one that more resembles Habermas' idea of deliberative rationality. So I think you cannot really combine Hayek and Habermas, stable preferences and deliberation.
Okay, that's great. And it's a short question, it's a deep question, so I'll give a shallow answer. John Rawls, great philosopher, has a footnote in a manuscript he never published, which said, we post a signpost, no deep thinking here, things are bad enough already. And that's at least part of my answer, that for much of the universe of nudging, I'd like to say the vast majority of the universe, and I think that's true, the difference between the ex ante and the ex post perspective of the chooser, there is none. So if you're a chooser and you don't want to pay a late fee on your credit card, and you get a text message telling you you're about to, your ex ante preference is, I don't want to pay that late fee, and that's your ex post preference too. If you are given an active choice about what you want your, let's say, your healthcare plan to look like, your ex ante choice and your ex post choice should be the same. The nudge is to ask you, and that's not going to change which plan you like. So the universe of nudges contains a vast array of cases where there's just no ex ante and ex post difference in the answer to that question. And I do want it to be Habermasian in the sense of people's deliberative rationality rather than their quick intuitive thinking, their reflective judgments. And I hope Hayek doesn't stand opposed to that. I hope. You're right, though, that there are cases where the preference might be affected by the default rule. And that makes this not so simple. That's why the usually is necessary. So if people ex ante, let's say, in a default rule where they have to sign up for something, their judgment is, I don't want to be there. And if the default rule is they're in, their judgment is they want to be there, then the welfare assessment is more difficult. And I think you're right, we can't use the as judged by themselves and just think the italics will do the necessary work. We might have to say something about what promotes people's welfare.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.